I'm really a guy who lives out in the woods. Don't have any of those special fancy titles, but I am a father, and I want my children to live in a Christian nation. And I want my children to live in a Christian nation.
Well, welcome back to The Lone Bulwark. I am Stephen Wolf. Thank you for joining me. So as you probably know already, we have moved all of our content to Supercast. Supercast is a service that is kind of like Patreon, but better. And you'll find all our content there. So the website is thelonebulwark.supercast.com. thelonebulwark.supercast.com. You find all the content that I do and I do with friends. So that would include this show. This show is then offered ad-free at Supercast, and you'll find the various plans you can be a part of. We also have Ars Politica. We have Ars Politica, which is me and my friend Thomas Acord, and that comes out as well. That'll be an exclusive. That's exclusive to Supercast, even though this is on YouTube. That will be exclusive to Supercast subscribers. And then we have also on offer the Scholar Series, which again is exclusive to Supercast. And the Scholar Series is me every week giving you about a 30-minute lecture on some topic. I've already done about a course and a half on traditional logic, and I will keep doing those every week. And so there'll be a large list eventually of several different courses on different topics, and you can access all of those on Supercast. And of course, if you sign up now, you'll get those every single week, including PowerPoint slides and often problem sets, if that's appropriate for the topic. And there's other benefits as well. You'll also get all of, or many of the old Ars Politica episodes that Thomas and I did from 2020 to 22. So there's several dozen old episodes you can access as well, again, exclusive to Supercast. So thank you for your support. You guys make this possible to do this, and so I appreciate we appreciate your support on that. So again, it's thelonebulwark.supercast.com. All right, thank you. So today I am going to talk about Christian identity and liberalism. Christian identity and liberalism. So for reasons that I am not privy to, I did not get the message or the email. I'm not in the group chat. But evangelicals, certain ones, have decided that it's time to reevaluate that old term Christian nationalism. They need to reevaluate it for some reason. So we had Andrew Walker did a piece for World Opinion, and he said it's not too late to abandon the term Christian nationalism, as if like it's funny because, you know, plenty of people have not used the term who agree with me on everything, but that doesn't, but it's funny. And then Al Mohler had his piece where he basically said that, yeah, you can use it. The left's going to call us it anyway, so why not just adopt it? But of course, I'm not an anti-Semitic, all that stuff.
Stay safe. Mask up. Get the vax. Don't take unnecessary risks. Be careful. We've been coddled, smothered in warnings, trained to fear and avoid risk. We've been taught to play it safe and be on our guard. And not just against a scraped knee or a failed endeavor. No, we've been taught to censor our speech, our words, even our thoughts. Don't think those dangerous thoughts. Don't notice. Don't speak out. If you do, we're coming for you. Who's coming for you? It almost doesn't even matter. Whether it's the HR lady at your company of either sex, weaponized church courts, the social media censors, or even those you once considered allies. Watch out. Take care. Play it safe. But was it always this way? Have we always lived under this kind of stifling, wet blanketing panopticon? Is this the spirit of our Christian forefathers? Of the men who founded our nation in blood and in faith, willing to face down all the might of Britannia and her redcoats? There was a time when Americans didn't shrink from risk, when they would rather die than bend. Our Christian forefathers knew what it was to draw the sword and throw away the scabbard. They knew what it was to set sail for the unknown. They defied tyrants. They built, explored, and dared great things. Who settled this land? Who built one of the greatest nations ever to be? Who settled the West and covered the continent from sea to sea with a Christian people? Who searched out glories, crisscrossed the plains with railroads, and fought off usurpers and invaders on all sides? Risk wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Without it, our fathers knew, there was no greatness. And now, we're supposed to trade boldness for bureaucracy? We're supposed to tremble at the unknown instead of mastering it? We're supposed to bow and scrape, not even before bullets, but before HR ladies? We don't think so. It's time to remember who we are. This year, join us here at New Christendom Press for our annual conference, Safety Third, Recovering the American Will to Greatness. 4 days to forge new friendships, build coalition, and work to recover what was lost. It's time to reclaim the spirit that built this nation, to break free from fear, to risk, to build, to lead. The future belongs to the bold.
Al Mohler said that he was a Christian nationalist. I don't think he wants to walk that back now, but he doesn't seem too active, unlike Doug Wilson, in trying to sort of police who can claim the label. But anyway, so this happened. Now, I've said it many times, and I've said it since November 2022, that I really don't care whether you adopt the label. I don't care. I really don't care. It's kind of neat that if you do, but it really doesn't bother me if you do. I only care, my central concern is that you would adopt the ideas that fall under the label. So you'd pick up the book, somewhere over there, you pick up the book and you'd agree with everything that I say. But if you choose to say, I don't want to adopt the label for myself, and what, because, for example, I don't like the term nationalism, right? If you don't like the term nationalism, I actually respect that view. I actually share the concerns people have with nationalism as a historical thing, and specifically because it has a history of centralized homogenization. That is, you have a nation state, and the state uses its power to essentially bring everyone within the state into the same culture. So a good example of this would be like France, where you have a centralized state with absolute power, and there was a concerted effort to Frenchify, or whatever, everyone within the boundaries of France. And then if you get the French Revolution, and all that sort of thing. So there is that element of the history of nationalism that I too share a concern with, and that's why many old paleo-conservatives rejected nationalism explicitly. In fact, they thought within the American context that nationalism was a New England project, and it was New England's effort to homogenize all of America. And that meant that the local spheres were eradicated under this nationalist culture. Now, I think America, as an aside, I think America is unique in that we have significant regional identities, but it's, to most people's minds, it's reconcilable with a national identity. So you can look at the military, have people from all different walks of life, all different spheres, all different accents, all different cultures and foods, all claim that identity, that sort of local identity, and yet also have this love of America as a broad nation. So I think America, in terms of American nationalism, has been able to reconcile the local and the national, albeit imperfectly. Nevertheless, I do respect, like my friend CJ Engel, he has said that he agrees with me on almost everything. And yet he does not adopt the term nationalism or Christian nationalism. So some have shifted to the New Christian Right, that label New Christian Right, or I prefer the Christian New Right, but it doesn't really matter. I don't care what you actually claim, but I think that we could actually have a broader movement if we centered around a type of Christian right labeling. And some people within that would be Christian nationalists, if they want to call themselves that, or whatever you want to call it. But I think what actually is capturing a broader movement among Reformed Protestants, and not only Reformed, but just Protestants broadly, is a resurgent Christian right. And that's a good thing. But I don't want to just go on and on about labels. So I want to critique what I think is going on behind this new critique of the label Christian nationalism. I think it's a rising. So you're going to have Andrew Walker saying this. He's a Southern Baptist Theological Seminary professor, But I think the concern is arising. I think we have to situate the concern outside of ideas. I mean, ideas are a part of it, but I think we have to understand people like Walker in terms of Christian identity. Okay. Now, when you hear something like Christian identitarianism, that's usually something on the right. Like I could be called that. We could be called that. But I think that Walker's central concern is actually a form of Christian identity amid liberalism. And I think this is also true for the broad evangelical intelligentsia. They're ultimately concerned with Christian identity in the midst of modern liberalism. Okay. In other words, they are the Christian identitarians, even though they probably wouldn't like being called that. So their political thought, it concedes the public square to liberalism. Okay. It demands the crafting of a Christian public identity. The crafting, that's an important word. The crafting of a Christian public identity. And this identity is an identity in relation to all other identities, right? So as I've said, in modern liberalism, it permits you a wide range of public identities. That's one of the sort of hallmarks of liberalism, of modern liberalism at least, and probably a bit on classical liberalism as well. It permits a wide range of public identities, and each can have its own strong claim to moral or amoral truth. They can have those strong claims. But the fundamental principle of liberalism is that you must never treat your identity as the ultimate vision for the public square. Okay, that is the terminus, the telos, the end of your efforts, is not to make your identity the exclusionary norm of society. All right, so that you cannot have as your purpose in politics to make your identity the sort of norm of society such that all other identities are second class or in some sense excluded. Right? So that you can't do that in liberalism. Everyone can have their own like conception of ultimate truth and the meaning of existence and worldview. Everyone can have that in liberalism. You just are not permitted to claim that yours is the one that ought to dominate such that it, in some effect, excludes all the rest. That's liberalism, modern liberalism at least. Okay. So in Walker's own words, Christians in the public sphere, public square, can practice what he says is contestation. He mentions that word several times in his book, Liberty for All. All right, so contestation. And this means that Christians can engage the public square with faith-based arguments. But typically these have been limited to specific moral concerns. So, on the height of concern would be abortion or religious liberty or gay marriage or transgender stuff. There might be a few others but for the most part, that's like the list of what people of what evangelicals tend to care about. All right, but the end of it, the purpose, the telos of your contestation, it's never to win the public square itself. Okay, it's never to win the public square itself. That is, you're never there to become the dominating force of public square. And it certainly is not, the end is not to make public institutions officially and explicitly Christian. So the central concern of Christian politics, and this goes back to like the moral majority formed in the 1980s, is to maintain the openness of the public square for contesting identities. So again, it's to maintain the openness of the public square for contesting identities. That's that's been the end of Christian politics in a way. I mean, of course, the end is these moral concerns as well, but one sort of general concern is that. So, and Walker, he even calls this constant state of contestation a constulocracy, a sort of rule by contestation. That's what liberalism basically basically is. So this ensures one purpose for this is that it ensures that Christians have the space to assert Christian values, right? So if you have an open public square, it's not Christian in itself, right? It's not dominated by Christians, but there's the openness such that you can contest, according to Christian values, your specific policy preferences that I mentioned, right? So there's a specific side of policy issues, usually moral concerns, deeply moral, universal moral concerns. But the general concern in Christian politics is to maintain the openness such that Christians can engage and yet not dominate. Like, right, they're not the norm setters in the public square that excludes contestation. They maintain the openness of the public square such that Christians can have free and equal contestation in the open square among others. Okay. All right. So, but again, the public square is not to become exclusively Christian. It must remain open enough to permit Christian engagement. Hence, the role of power and the themes of dominion are going to be diminished. And political hope is placed in rational persuasion of fellow sinners or in some form of winsome political witness. All right, so you're in the public square contesting. You're not even, you can do some politicking as well. And this is why, for example, Walker emphasizes natural law, because natural law is a universal law, and you can engage your non-Christian neighbor in natural law in principle because that non-Christian neighbor ought to believe in the principles and truths of natural law. It's universal. Everyone has reason, and therefore you can use the instrument of reason to convince someone of this universal law. So it kind of fits. It makes sense that he would emphasize natural law in this space of contestation among other people of different identities, right? Now, so Walker also believes that Christians are uniquely suited to this calling. All right, so such that we are responsible as good Christians to maintain this arena of contestation. So there's something about Christianity that recognizes this truth of liberalism such that society should not be dominated by Christians, and yet Christians should dominate it in a sense that it maintains its openness. Okay. So in addition to these specific moral policies, Christian politics is committed to maintaining political liberalism. Now, by liberalism, I don't mean Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. I mean a broad conception of liberalism that even the post-war conservatives would be a part of, right? So National Review is politically liberal. It's always been politically liberal. And strictly according to a broad conception of philosophical liberalism, everyone in the United States is basically a liberal, or at least everyone that appears on television is going to be a liberal in some capacity. But in common speech, we say liberal, we mean a certain, like the Democratic Party, basically. But that's not philosophically, that's not accurate. All right, but since non-Christians, and this would be accepting many Jews, they naturally war against this openness. All right, so Christians are well suited to this type of open liberalism, but non-Christian worldviews are not. And that's why across the world you see a lot of closed societies. China, you could say that parts of India are closed. You have sort of closed society in most places, but in Christian society, in the Christian West particularly, there is the rise of open liberalism. And that just indicates that Christianity is uniquely suited to produce a liberal society. All right. But this means that we as Christians have to, in a way, engage and maintain this openness. We need to appeal to these non-Christians to maintain the openness with promises that you can express yourself, you can be who you are, you can maintain your identity. We're not coming for you. All we want to make sure is that the public sphere is an open arena of contestation. Right? So that means that our Christian struggle is not merely the specific, policies, but it's to ward off the anti-liberal tendencies inherent to non-Christian worldviews. Right? So the result then is what I would call a wild tension of Christians and Jews, because Jews tend to be on the openness side, who share Judeo-Christian values, struggling to secure a public square of open contestation. Okay? Even against those identities that naturally seek public dominance or preferential treatment. So we're here then to secure an open society that permits contested visions, even the visions of a closed society. Those are permitted. You can speak publicly and you should not suffer any sort of harm as a result. Certainly not by law. So this is our general Christian political calling. And so it's no surprise that Walker and all the rest don't like Christian nationalism. Because what are we arguing for? We're arguing for a Christian public political order. That is, Christians will then dominate public political society, and any views that are anti-Christian will be suppressed through some means, whether it's through law or socially, which is preferable. So that this is why Walker would not like this view, I think, anyway. But I think to hold Walker's view coherently, this means that we must contend for an open society with non-Christians, right? So we can't dominate and enact, because you can't have a Christian dominated, that is in a sort of formal institutional sense. You have to work then with non-Christians, and you have to appeal to non-Christians in order to maintain that open society. Now, this seems to me to be necessary, again, because you cannot dominate, and you have to convince non-Christians who have a proclivity to not go along with, liberalism. You have to convince them of the open society, right? And so what does this mean? That means we have to craft a public identity that is appealing or winsome to others, right? We have to shape our public identity to have an appeal to others. Now, I don't mean that, I mean that in kind of a neutral sense. So I'm not actually, that's not meant to be a criticism yet, okay? I'm just saying that doesn't mean we're losing orthodoxy. That doesn't mean we're losing Christian practice or Christian principles. It just means we're orienting our rhetoric through all the different modes of rhetoric. We're orienting that to make ourselves a sort of appeal to others such that we can maintain that open society. That's really what I mean there. All right. But I think naturally, this means that a significant portion of Christian, public engagement, as they like to say, will be devoted to rhetorical posturing and moralistic language and conformity to the prevailing norms of discourse or discursive norms. So, because again, if maintaining liberalism is our unique calling, then we must conform our public engagement to the prevailing standards of persuasion, right? We have to conform the way that we engage to the standards of persuasion that we come across. Now, again, this in itself is not wrong. As Aristotle taught us, whenever you're going to argue something, you have to assess your audience such that you can discern the means of persuasion. All right. So there's nothing wrong in that principle. I'm talking to you, and I'm thinking about what my audience, who my audience is. And so I'm conforming my modes of persuasion for that reason. I hopefully not in an unprincipled way. But anyway, so these are the standards but according to liberalism, we can't set those standards in a sort of domineering way. We can't dictate or control those standards alone. So it requires us, in other words, that is this, I think, Walker's liberalism. It requires us to conform to prevailing norms, right? And then these are either formed by some combination of everyone, or perhaps by some principal part of society, or some group that is able to kind of shape the standards of rhetoric. And this has to be, like I said, in all modes of rhetoric. So you have logos, ethos, and pathos. Logos basically meaning the reasons, ethos meaning establishing credibility, and pathos being the sort of emotions that you express at the right moment to the right people. So Christians must shape their public identity around these norms, and of course, without abandoning orthodoxy. So I'm not saying that Walker or any of them are abandoning Christian orthodoxy. I'm talking about the mode of rhetoric, right? Their conclusions can actually be very true, and yet the way they go about arguing those would be conformed to the dominating expectations of society with regard to rhetoric, if that makes sense. All right. So, but all these things are shaped to maintain public appeal, and they have to maintain public appeal because that's the only way you can convince the other identities that they ought to have this open society such that Christians can be equal participants in the public square, right? This is not me, like, I think this is coherent, even though I disagree with it, right? If you're going to say that the general end of Christian politics is to maintain an open society such that Christians can engage according to their specific moral concerns, then you have to appeal to a lot of people who are not Christian in order to maintain that open society, right? And so that means you have to then conform your rhetoric to the standard of, to the means of persuasion presented to you in society, which, by the way, you cannot yourself dominate and control, right? So you have to shift it. So what does this mean? So I think that means that evangelical leaders have, as I said, conform their engagement to the prevailing rhetorical norms, and they choose their style of engagement in any given case accordingly. Hence, the world and its news cycle determine what they publicly care about, right? The world and its news cycle determine what they publicly care about. Why would you publicly engage on things no one else cares about? It's not doing anything for you. It's not crafting an identity, an appealing identity. So the murder of Christians in Africa, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, barely get mentioned at all by these people, if at all. Like sometimes they might say something, but usually not. I follow several different evangelical accounts on Twitter, and I have not seen them mention this stuff. And yet, they will express outrage over the latest current thing. So something happening in Israel or Ukraine or something Putin said, whatever it is. Because they have to craft a public appeal, an identity that's appealing to the public, they have to comment and engage on what is presented to them. Because what's presented to them through various media as what we should all care about, the current thing, is the means by which you will present your public identity to the people you're trying to appeal to, right? Now, what this means is they also proudly critique both left and right. You hear that over and over. Yeah, I critique both left and right. And what does this do? So this is, again, it's shoring up a sort of Christian public identity. And it's often comes with abusive ad hominems against fellow Christians. You see this all the time. If you're too right-wing, you get abusive ad hominems. And this is against fellow Christians, right? And that makes sense because Christians who are outside of liberalism or critiquing the wrong people or saying things that make people upset, that harms the public identity. Like the central concern in their mind is that guy is saying things and he identifies as Christian, I identify as Christian, people are recognizing that, so I need to attack that guy, with the gaze of the left or the center right or whoever it is, such that my identity and the Christian identity broadly is secured. It remains appealing. Oh, we're not like those guys over there. The rhetoric even goes to the point of just to anathematize people. And that's actually makes sense. The reason why we hear all this sort of anathematizing toward the Christian right is because, they're not actually Christians. We can't actually claim them. We are de-churching them. And why are they doing this? They're doing this for the gaze and the gaze of the center and the moderate crowd and the left. Right. And this because the Christians are insufficiently liberal, or perhaps they violate the proper rhetorical norms. And so what you see is that these people are gentle and lowly with homosexuality, transgender, but they denounce the right as Nazis and Jew haters. So you see that they've conformed to the prevailing norm, which as anyone an inch to your right can be treated with disgust, and anyone far, far to your right, you can disagree with them, but you have to engage them in a winsome manner. You have to be gentle and lowly. You have to be humble, listening. You have to agree with their, agree with their life story with regard to those bad Christians who said that they were actually evil and going to hell. You have to be gentle and lowly with that. Right. Again, conforming to the prevailing rhetorical norms to craft an identity. All right. So, but the effect, I've been talking about Christian elites, but the effect is that the regular evangelical has come to embody these discursive norms. Your average evangelicals embody them. So evangelicals might not like the rainbow flag at that coffee shop or that bookshop, but it doesn't incite a visceral reaction. It doesn't give them a sort of fight or flight reaction, nor does it cause them to, storm out of the room, speak to the manager. And why is that? Well, because they want to be good neighbors, and we must love our enemies. So that rhetoric is applied to the left. Be good neighbors, love your enemies, be winsome. That's applied to people on the left. But of course, if you walked into a coffee shop or a bookshop and you saw a Confederate battle flag, imagine that. The reaction for even the average evangelical, I suspect, it would arise like spontaneously from their souls. It would be far different. It would strike them emotionally. It would cause them to flee. That fight or flight moment would occur, and they'd have to make a choice. And they might even storm out, stomp out, have a word with the manager, and leave a nasty review online. But see, this is just the cost of being winsome in a liberal age, right? This is the cost. You have one side, the left, wants to craft these various degenerate identities that you disagree with, but they are identities. But on the right, you have people who want to actually have a closed society. You want to limit that, so-called liberty within society. And so you get this asymmetry, right? But again, this is what happens when you are under the gaze of the left. And so let's be clear. Christians are willing to express indignation. It's sometimes you don't know this by listening to the rhetoric of the gentle and lowly sort of rhetoric. You don't realize that. You don't know, no, we can't suffer indignation. We can't express that. We are not weak. We on the right like to say that evangelicalism is weak. We are not weak. But my point is that it is the society that has determined for them and us the appropriate objects of our ire, of our indignation. We will express indignation towards the people that we're told not to like, that we'll feel it in our soul that that's bad, but not the rainbow flag. Right? So this asymmetric posturing it's necessary. It's necessary given the political thought that I've already been describing. And really, since the 1980s, evangelicals have sought to restore Christian values and policy, but these have always been, like I said, mere isolated moral issues. There never was a vision for Christianity to be the norm setter of public society that would direct the standards of credibility and establish the appropriate objects of indignation. We thought that strong families and strong churches conceived in like these like sort of quasi-separatist terms, that was enough. That was enough to shape our public engagement. But that has proven just to be false. Like social norms remain dominant. Social norms originating from largely outside of us. And evangelical leaders, for the most part, have just Christianized them. Like our Christian ethics have just conformed. They've been Christianized, and they've been determined by society, broadly speaking. Now, again, I'm not saying that they're telling us to accept homosexuality as good and whatever. I'm saying our rhetorical posturing towards that has been shaped. I'm speaking not at the realm of orthodoxy or orthopraxy with regard to moral principles, but the nature in which we engage these things. Okay. And I would say even the role of Christian education is really now a matter of shaping the Christian identity for winsomeness before the gaze of modern liberalism. I think this is true for most classical Christian schools as well, even though they're learning most of what they read is far older than them, and yet there still is a sort of spirit of we need to engage the world for Christ, but it's always according to, I think, often according to the gaze of modern liberalism. So in the attempt to be in the world but not of the world, we have come to adopt the rhetorical patterns of the world. Right? You often hear a reply to that is like, well, but I oppose transgenderism, and I've faced the ire of the left. But this is what we have to understand is liberalism is not merely a left-wing ideology. The liberal gaze is strong with people on the center-right or the moderate or the center-left. So people like Jordan Peterson, Barry Weiss, Tom Holland, James Lindsay, Ben Shapiro, at times they will speak highly of Christianity. Sometimes like Jordan Peterson will just, speak over and over about it. And they do this each in their own way. And some of these people are even call themselves culturally Christian. But why is that? Why do they not actually affirm any of the theology, but they like Christianity? That's because for them, it is a vehicle for liberalism. They see Christianity as a necessary component to maintain liberalism and also some of their other pet interests. But it's mainly about liberalism. By their lights, good Christians are good liberals. So we have to understand that the liberal gaze is not merely that of the blue-haired crazy lady. Mainstream conservatives cast just as much a liberal gaze as the left, right? So we have to keep that in mind. There's still the liberalism, broad liberalism conceived, that still pervades even among conservatives, right? And they cast the gaze, cast a glance, cast a look, and these evangelicals conform. All right. So the evangelical intelligentsia are therefore Christian identitarians. All right. Their job is to craft a public theology of moral witness that is centered around shaping a Christian identity that engages other identities under the conditions of modern liberalism. Right. And the goal is to maintain liberalism. Right? Because since Christianity is not, and to most of their minds cannot be, the norm setter of public ethos or pathos, Christian identity must conform in rhetoric to the prevailing discursive norms of society. And what I think this explains like what we find in evangelical engagement today. I think it explains pretty much almost everything, right? It explains, for example, the evangelical anxiety around the term Christian nationalism. And it's why they must denounce it, often without argument, the ideas that they want to associate with it, right? Because Christian nationalism is a derogatory term of the left for the right. So why adopt it? Then you're going to be under the gaze of the left. Also, Christian nationalism is a dominion theology. And that means that it's anti-liberal and it's going to offend the very sort of people you're trying to appeal to. So for that reason, if you're trying to craft a public identity that is appealing to other identities, calling yourself Christian nationalism would not actually do it. And so I think that explains a big reason as to why There's so much anxiety over the label, right? But the thing is, they must do this since the liberal gaze shapes their style of engagement, right? The liberal gaze matters because there cannot be a distinctively Christian gaze that norms society, right? We have to join other identities in having this sort of, gaze towards the people who are not sufficiently liberal, right? We have to join others. We can't have, hey, we as Christians need to look and demand Christian behavior or suppress bad behavior. We can't do that as Christians. We need to do it as humans among other humans, again, under the conditions of modern liberalism, right? So the whole point is the craft of this public identity in relation to the gaze to fulfill our general calling, to maintain an open society, which frees us to advocate for specific moral policy preferences, all right? So I myself, I have no concern with labels, as I've said, partly because I don't exist under the liberal gaze. I don't care that Christian nationalism scares people like Bari Weiss. I'm not here to mollify her fears. People like her are right about Christian nationalism in a way. I mean, the liberals who are afraid of Christian nationalism, they're right in a way. In a Christian public order, someone like her would have very little power and influence. They wouldn't have the sort of reach that they have. The problem is, though, that according to respectable public theologians, I hate the term public theology, by the way. The very job of a Christian in public life, according to the public theologians, is to ensure that someone like Bari Weiss does have a voice, and perhaps even a significant one, because if she isn't free, then I can't be free. So what we find then is, I think, a sort of impasse between the Christian New Right and the evangelical liberal conservatives. The former want a nation. They want a nation which, being Christian, is the norm. That is, we in the Christian right. We want a nation that is a Christian nation, where such that Christianity in a robust sense is the norm. And this would mean that Christians as Christians are the norm setters of society. That is, Christians are those to whom everyone else conform. But the thing is, the evangelical intelligentsia want, in principle, an egalitarian, liberal, or, quote, common society. But in practice, as I've said, this requires Christians to conform and to shape their public identity around the norms of others. Right? So it is evident, however, that principled debate over these two visions is just nearly impossible. And that's partly because liberalism will not allow it. If you're committed to liberalism, there is no room within the liberal socio-rhetorical norm in which you as a non-liberal can participate as an equal player. That this is kind of one of the ironies here. You can have a vision of a so-called closed society, and you can even speak as much as you want. You can talk. You have the legal right to say whatever you want. But the fact is that your speech will not be engaged in a sort of principled way. You won't get gentle and lowly sort of treatment. What you'll get instead is guilt by association. You'll get undistributed middles. Look that one up, undistributed middles. You'll get exaggerations. You'll get moral denunciation. You'll get careless labeling. And of course, from Christians and seemingly not Christians, like James Lindsay likes to call certain Christians not true Christians. You'll get, in other words, anathematizing. But why is this? Again, you're under the gaze of liberalism. It's all performed for our societal superiors. If you're trying to appeal to the public of non-Christian identities and craft an identity to be appealing, you have to then perform rhetorically for that superior. Now, that superior could be society itself. It could be a principal group within society that seems to be able to shape everything, or whoever it is. You have to come to appeal to that superior. You are a subordinate rhetorically to that superior. And if that superior says, hey, those Christian nationalists are bad, they question the social dogma of our time, they are scary, then you're going to get, as I said, the exaggerations, the moral denunciation, the careless labeling, and the anathematizing. That's where you're going to get. Again, that explains a lot of the behavior over the last couple of years. But this is the thing. I think the best we can do on the right, the best the right can do, because we're at the impasse, and I think we do it very well, is we have to appeal to the mentally unshackled. We have to appeal to the mentally unshackled. And we just have to, at times, dust off our feet and press forward. And by mentally unshackled, I've said this before, and this is even true among classical liberals. John Locke says this. Most people follow what is fashionable. And I don't just mean clothing. I mean, they follow the path of least resistance when it comes to society. There's only the few that see things for how they are and mentally will themselves out of that. Most people will just conform to whatever Fox News tells them or whatever CNN tells them. They'll think they're thinking for themselves, but they only have one source of information, and frankly, they want to just go on with their life and not cause too much trouble. There's only the few who are able to be sort of mentally unshackled. And when you have the few tend to be considered psychologically weird or disturbed, or they're crazy, or they're evil. The few who will actually question the way things are and seek to do something about it and say ideas, speak ideas that go against the social dogma of the time, those people are going to be psychologized. They're going to be bulverized. They're not going to be engaged winsomely, gentle and lowly. They're not going to get a seat at the table. But it's freeing to be the mentally unshackled. It's freeing to look out and say, the entire narrative and message that we're receiving is false. That actually the game of rhetoric in liberalism is for our destruction. It's oriented towards us and our children and our grandchildren losing, and losing in big ways. And more than that, it's about tearing us apart, tearing us away from our own ancestors. It's isolating us. It's putting us in the present. It's making us enraptured by the current thing. Whatever is presented on the television that night, we have to care about, we have to have an opinion on. And by the way, there's only two sides. Sometimes there's only one side. But it's going to, in the end, be the few. So the best the right can do is be smart and appeal to the people who are mentally unshackled. And so that's what I've hoped to do. I hope to do that in, of course, a principled way. And so I hope we move forward. All right, well, thank you for watching this. All right, welcome back. So as you can tell, I've changed shirts, and I did it rather quickly for some reason. Actually, it's just a couple days later. But anyway, let's get on to the next segment. So I've written the second of a series of articles for American Reformer arguing for Christian nations. And they're philosophical arguments, they're syllogistic arguments, they're meant to be concise and to the point, and to really kind of give a, not a rough, but like a short version of what could be a much longer argument, probably better in like a sort of journal, but I'm giving the condensed version. So here's the first one was the moral argument, I believe I called it, for Christian nations. This one is called the two goods argument for Christian nations, the two goods argument for Christian nations. Okay. Again, the second argument. I'm going to go through a series of premises, and admittedly, this argument is, as written, is a bit clunky. And there's a sort of editorial history behind that, I guess, a bit. Now, I'm not blaming an editor. I'm just saying that it's my fault. But anyway, it's a bit clunky. But I will explain it as I go through, and hopefully you'll be convinced, if you're not already, that actually nations can and ought to be Christian. So here's the argument, and I try to reach that conclusion with principle and logic and all that sort of thing. All right, so if you think this is valid and my premises are true, then guess what? You got to affirm the conclusion. That's how things work, right? All right, so here's the first premise. So every entity created by God is equipped with the means necessary to fulfill each of its God-ordained ends. All right, so I'm at the level of entity right now. And what I'm saying is that everything that God creates, and when he assigns or there's ends or a purpose or a telos to that thing, it must be equipped with the means to achieve that. So if you take a human beings, the telos, the end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. Well, he must be equipped with the sort of means or the faculties or the capabilities to achieve that God-ordained end, right? So we are to worship God, and that requires rationality, that requires moral judgment, requires action, and so God equipped man with all those things such that he can actually fulfill the God-ordained, the ends God-ordained for him. But I'm just at the level of entity, which is very ambiguous, or I should say extensive. And we'll move through it. But the central idea is that ought implies can. That's the central premise. Even Reformed people who believe in predestination and also total inability or total depravity affirm that ought implies can. But that's kind of a separate issue. But all right, so the second premise is the nation is an entity created by God. All right, so the nation is an entity created by God. Now, this is true regardless whether it's pre-fall or post-fall. You don't have to follow my argument early in my book where I say that nations were a pre-fall entity. It doesn't really matter to my knowledge, but this premise is true regardless of your whether you think nations are post-fall. Okay, but the thing is, because of those two premises I've laid out, they necessarily follow a valid syllogism, and the conclusion would be that the nation is provided with the means necessary to fulfill each of its ends. So God created the nation. He created the nation for certain things, and that means he equipped that nation or all nations in principle with the means for them to fulfill the purpose of the nation. All right, so that's the conclusion from those two premises. We won't see those again, but that conclusion, what follows from that is the following. So every end of the nation or every purpose of the nation is something for which God has provided the nation with sufficient means to fulfill. That's just kind of another way of saying what I already said, that every single end that the nation has, whatever those ends are, it has equipped the nation. God has equipped the nation such that it can, with good principle, with good moral ethics, achieve those ends. Okay? Now, here's the next premise. Excuse me. And that is that promoting earthly good is an end of the nation. Okay, so one purpose of the nation, regardless of other purposes, is to promote good among fellow man. I mean, that's why men join into society. That's why we're drawn to existing amongst our fellow humans, because we by doing that can actually maximize our individual good. And so the reason nations form is for the various goods of earthly life, right? It's to promote, we form nations typically almost, always with some form of government, whether very simple or complex, and that is to promote the earthly good amongst the people in the nation, right? So that shouldn't be too controversial. What I have done is I have revealed one end I'm talking about. And what that means, of course, is that this conclusion, which is promoting earthly good, is something for which God has provided the nation sufficient means to fulfill. So before it was whatever end the nation has, it has the means. So I'm actually saying that promoting earthly good is one of those ends, and therefore it has the sufficient means to promote that. So to kind of summarize what the argument's been so far, it is, since an end of the nation is the promotion of earthly good, And since God has equipped the nation with the means to fulfill its ends, the nation has been or is provided with the means necessary to promote earthly good. All right, that seems to follow from everything I've said so far, that the end of the nation, one end of the nation is to promote earthly good. God has equipped entities such that whatever their ends are, they'd have the means to fulfill them. Therefore, nations have the ability to promote earthly good. All right. But here comes the controversial premise. And that is that the nation can only effectively promote earthly good if it also promotes heavenly good. That's probably so far the most controversial premise. That is that in order for the nation to promote earthly good, it has to promote heavenly good as well. All right, so here's my defense of that premise. And it's the moral law of God, consisting of both tables, that is the first table and the second table, they cannot be separated, okay? Because it's a single, coherent, mutually dependent law. You know, we can speak of virtue and piety as being different in their content, in their object, but true virtue is not achievable ordinarily without true piety. So when you abandon the first table, you will eventually lose the second table. So when you have a body politic, you know, oftentimes the body politic is a sort of analogy of the human person. But when you have that body politic, which is full of regular people, which typically, you know, a group of people is full of regular people, piety is ancillary or a necessary support to virtue. Okay, so a virtuous citizenry requires a pious citizenry. So a civil government cannot fulfill its end of civil virtue, its purpose of promoting civil virtue, without at least the presence of piety among the people. Right? So in other words, in order for the civil government to achieve, or let's just say the nation broadly, you can talk of the civil government as an entity or something extending out of the nation. But in order for the nation to fulfill its duty of achieving a virtuous citizenry, it must also have at least the presence of piety, because piety and virtue are not to be separated. It's part of one law. It's part of God's law. And you can distinguish these things. You can distinguish as in duties to God and duties to man, but you cannot separate them. You cannot separate the two tables. If you lose the first table, you're eventually going to lose the second table. And this is even more true among a very, a type of secularism in which the nation as such is not to be concerned with anything of the first table. So at the very least, a lot of pagan societies had false religion, and that false religion functioned to actually promote in limited ways their own virtue. Right? This sort of thing has been recognized. The connection of piety and virtue has been recognized not just by Christians, but by pagan philosophers. Right? You'll find it in Plato. You'll find it in Aristotle. You find it in Xenophon. You'll find it in Cicero. Also, all across the place. Plutarch. You'll always find this. All right. So now the civil administration or the civil government, it cannot, of course, administer the things of piety, right? It cannot administer the things of eternal life. That's the role of the church, the instituted church. But the civil government, given its end of virtue, has an interest in flourishing in true religious ministry. It has an interest in promoting that for the reasons I already just explained. It has a particular interest because it cannot actually achieve its own end without the presence of piety. Okay, so for this reason, it has the powers around sacred things, not in the sacred things, as if the civil magistrate can administer word and sacrament. but it has an interest in promoting the external form of true religion in the interest of public virtue. So this is what I would call the positive side of power regarding religion. Okay, so they're acting for true religion. But some people will not want to talk about or will reject a positive side. So I would argue for that, but I'm gonna go for a more limited argument, just because I don't want to spend time on that. But it does seem, though, that civil power has a negative authority regarding religion, by which I mean that they can suppress that which would ordinarily harm virtue, right? They have an interest in promoting virtue, and they can therefore suppress that which harms virtue. Well, if gross impiety, blasphemy, irreligion, and subversive religion harm virtue, then the civil government has the power to suppress those things. And really, they have this power by necessity. Again, their God-ordained end is to promote virtue. You cannot promote virtue when there's public impiety, irreligion, and all that sort of thing. So that would mean then they are equipped by God such that they can suppress those things that would kill virtue, which I already listed. Okay. Yeah. Or you could also say, so I would say restrain. You also use a fancy word, discountenance. That is to look upon disfavorably. So what this means is not just the civil government, it could be the nation itself. The nation itself as a society would use its social power, its function of praise and blame to discountenance that which is virtue killing. And again, I didn't put this in the paper, but we do this all the time. Racism, anti-Semitism, and that's just in speech. But of course, we look down upon violence. We look down upon public aggression, unjust public aggression. We look down upon certain forms of rudeness. So what I'm saying, if it's true that you have to have piety in order to have virtue, and that's an end of the nation, then the nation as such ought to discountenance the things that kill virtue, namely irreligion, gross impiety, blasphemy, and subversive religion. Okay. So again, they have the means to restrain or at least discountenance that which is virtue killing. So I think we can conclude that God has provided the nation the power to promote true religion and or, I'll give you the or suppress or discountenance false religion and irreligion. Okay. And I think that has followed, even if you don't affirm the positive function, the negative function at the very least should follow from these premises. So if you've followed me so far and you haven't raised a big objection to anything I've said with regard to the premises, it would seem to follow that yes, the nation as such can discountenance and suppress through its various God-ordained means the things that are virtue killing, namely false religion and irreligion. Now, let's keep moving on. Now, since Christianity alone is the true religion, so we've been talking about religion in broad terms, then God has provided the nation a power to promote the Christian religion, or at least suppress and discountenance false and irreligion, right? So again, if we're talking about promoting the true religion or promoting or to suppress that which is contrary to the true religion, and Christianity is the true religion, then it follows logically that anything that you either promote Christianity or you suppress that which is anti-Christianity. Okay? Now, the very last point here is that since all entities ought to seek to fulfill their ends, using the necessary powers that God has ordained for those ends, it follows that the nation ought to at least suppress false religion and irreligion, right? So if you have a God-ordained end and you have the means to fulfill that end, then that raises a duty, that is ought. You have an ought there. So the nation ought to do that. It's not simply an option if it's, like if we decide to do it, it's actually a duty itself. All right. So that means that the nation itself has the duty, has the means to achieve the end of civil virtue, because, and which includes, therefore, by necessity of the demands of promoting virtue, they have the powers to suppress that which is irreligion or false religion or subversive religion or blasphemy, atheism, and they do it in the interest of virtue, given those premises. So that is the argument. I will add I don't know if this is a qualification, but I think add something to the argument, and that is that whatever the nation or the state does has to be in accordance with prudence. And prudence is not cowardice. Prudence does not overthrow, does not preclude, assertive, resolute action. What it does mean is you have to look at the possibilities of action within a context, within circumstances. And so if you are 50% Muslim and 50% Christian, you're probably going to have a hard time actively, directly suppressing Islam. Maybe you can, but you may not. It would fail to achieve your end, the end of a nation. It would fail to fulfill your duty by trying to absolutely follow this command in an absolute sense, which would result in the overthrow of your state, the overthrow of your nation, the suppression of true religion, the destruction in that locality of true religion. So you have to then act prudently. What I think our problem is, I've said this before, and I'll just end it with this, is that our problem in our country, in the West, is a lack of will. Now, I don't think, according to the American tradition, we have robust religious liberties in a legal sense. But for most of our history, it was understood as a characteristic of the nation and understood by individuals that we are a Christian, particularly a Protestant country. And it was meant to remain that. And it wasn't until the last few decades when that was called into serious question. So this country, in terms of the broad American tradition, affirms that we are, and we're, in a more objective sense, a more kind of external sense, a Christian nation. We ought to be a Christian nation. And more than that, the various liberties that we enjoy as Americans is undergirded by the Christianity. And for most of the history, it was undergirded by a sense that Protestantism is a necessary feature or necessary element of those liberties. That is, if you lose Protestantism, you lose the liberties. There's a lot I can say about that. But so anyway, that is the argument. And there's more could be said about that argument. But that's it. So yeah, if you want virtue, you need piety. If an end is virtue, then you also have to have an end in some regard with piety. And so that's what the nation has. A brief last word before we close out this episode. Let's talk a little bit about sacralism. Sacralism. Now, I was apprehensive to talk about this term because I don't think it actually means much, and if it means something, then I'm not sure what use it is. I think it's actually far more a rhetorical device than anything else. So what you do is you go through a few events in history where there was violence against dissenting religious individuals. You call that sacralism, and then you call your modern day, your present opponents sacralists. And so then these people are then connected to that historical group of people, so it looks bad. So really it's you might call it a scary term fallacy, which is very, very common in our day. It's been common my entire life, like socialism or communism or Marxism or, liberal or whatever. The whole point of an argument is just to reduce someone to a scary label. So that's the function of sacralism. It doesn't surprise me that James White likes that term because that's the sort of thing but anyway, so sacralism, let's talk about it. This is why I don't think it's a very good term. I think it's trying to capture a lot of very, very different ideas in political theology, just lumping them all together And it's a way to dismiss each one. So these things have been debated for hundreds, thousands of years, but you can just, with one swoop, just take out the entire tradition with the word sacralism. And that's a problem. So by sacralism, I'm assuming we mean like unum sanctum, which is a papal bull from about 1,000 years ago, that said that the word in which the Pope declared himself to have not only spiritual power, but also temporal power. That is to have the sword of the Spirit and also have the sword, the civil sword, right? And that meant that all civil authority was delegated by him in a way such that he could return it and take it back. And so after the Reformation, you saw various kings and queens and princes and other sort of civil authorities excommunicated by the Pope. And in effect, that meant that the loyal papists could then be subversive, at times attempt to murder these people. They could be treated as false rulers and therefore disobeyed and disregarded. And so that was a real thing within Roman Catholic political theology. They also, Roman Catholics tended within the 16th and 17th centuries to be utterly brutal when it came to those whom they considered heretics. And they believe that many of them believe that you could only have one religion, one conception of Christianity within a certain society. And because they have such an extensive list of dogma, just look at Trent, if Council of Trent is dogma, that's quite a long list of things you must affirm it precisely. It was very easy, and it is very easy in Roman Catholicism to be a heretic. If you disagree with these long list of statements, therefore you are outside the communion of the Roman Catholic Church, and so forth. So, in other words, that is one understanding of political theology that is captured by sacralism. You could take something like Calvin's Geneva or others that viewed the society, broadly speaking, as a society of Christians, and therefore could be regulated by the state as such. There was a recognition of the liberty of conscience. Even so, heretics themselves went through a fairly lengthy process of attempting to refute. So the pastors would go first and they would try to convince them out. So take Servetus, for example. And then only then after they were obstinate were they then, in a way, the civil authorities sort of took over to deal with them. So there's different processes. Of course, you could have different disagreements. In Geneva, you had a Lutheran congregation, as I understand it. You had English congregations for the refugees. So, and very early on within Protestantism, this is earliest I've seen, and I'm sure it's earlier. Earliest I've seen is like in 1590 and probably earlier. There was a recognition of disagreements and differences within a society where people could have their different churches. There could still be an official dogma of the land, and yet these people who were not considered heretics could practice the religion as they saw fit. So this is recognized by Daniel, it's recognized by Keckerman, it's recognized by Althusius, and this is all within that early period of, about 1590 to about 16 or about 1610 or 1615, around that time. So that's one conception. And of course, there was active promotion of religion by the state. There's other conceptions too called Erastianism, which is a bit older than what I've talked about so far, apart from Trent. This was picked up by also Richard Hooker in late 16th century. And this was the idea that the state could actually could take on the function of spiritual discipline. It also meant that the magistrate not only had powers around the church, but could order the ecclesiastical realm itself. In other words, they could say, this is going to be your polity. Also, that he would have the exclusive power to appoint bishops and have power over priests. You could have, say, another argument would be the Book of Common Prayer, things like that. That was all part of the early Anglican world and often called Erastianism by none other than the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists. Presbyterians believed in a more independent church. That is, that it was the duty of ministers to determine the polity. They did permit at times, especially in Continental Reformed side, you read this in Turton, where the civil magistrate does have some role in approving the ministers. I don't know. I'm assuming there was disagreement on that among some people, but the Congregationalists did not approve of that. But anyway, that was a Presbyterian model, more of an independent church, and yet they still believed. You could take Rutherford, for example. They still believed the state could act to suppress heresy in the public realm. So it wasn't just the role of the ministers to suppress heresy, because they had no coercive power. Their context was in the church itself. They did not have a sort of, they weren't members of the state. They were members of the church. They were ministers of the church. And so if someone is in public doing heresy, or if they're in a false church, they're not actually in the church. They've created a false church. And therefore the civil magistrate, seeing them as, being a false church, could suppress that. Okay. So that was, and it was not a function throughout all this time. It was not a function of coercing the interior of man's soul or their minds or their conscience. Everyone rejected that. Calvin rejected it. Luther rejected it. Everyone rejected, even when they believed that you could go to the extent of executing heretics. They did not believe that any sort of outward action or the use of the sword could bring people to true faith. Nor did they believe that you could even call that an end of a purpose of the sword. Not only does it not work in principle, it would be wrong to try to make it work. So everyone denied that. Nevertheless, they believed that society should be Christian and regulated by Christian norms and Christian laws. And this is even when the people are defiant and seek to subvert that. You can be resolute and see that done. This could even be done. It's not as if the state can pry into the minds of people and see if they're true believers. What they know is that there are Christians in this society. It's majority Christian, or at least entirely Christian if they're just all Paedo-Baptists. That is in an outward sense. They're in the visible church. And for that reason, they can then regulate according to that. And any defiance, according to true Christian law, would be defiance against, Christian law. So I guess that all that so far is part of sacralism. And then you move on to, let's say, the Congregationalist, also known as the Independents in England and elsewhere. They had a more independent model. So it wasn't Presbyterian, because Presbyterian has a sort of hierarchy built into its ecclesiology. The Congregationalists did not. They were aligned, but informally. So they did believe in kind of independent Congregationalist churches, and those congregations are the ones who appoint the ministers. So there isn't a sort of presbytery in which you become a member of that higher order. So Presbyterian church, of course, you have local churches, and then the ministers are actually members of the presbytery, and that presbytery has power over the ordination, over all sorts of things. There was none of that within the Congregationalisms taken New England, which kind of exemplifies that. Is that sacralism? Of course, they were Paedo-Baptists, but they didn't force anyone to go to church. They were actually very resistant to making the children of the original settlers full communion members. That was one of the crises in the second and third generation of New England, was that too many of the younger people did not have enough of a sort of credible faith to bring them into full communion members. And because of their politics, that was kind of a crisis that was resolved in various ways, or perhaps not resolved at all, according to someone like Glenn Moots. It just kind of took its course. But anyway, is that sacralism as well? Of course, they did suppress the Antinomians and the Quakers and the Baptists later on, and of course, poor Roger Williams, right? So there was that as well. And of course, that's a far more complicated history than, they were just persecuting the Baptists. And you can watch a video in which I talk about this, and I'll probably do another one later in more detail. I guess that was sacralism as well. They all travel across ships from the old world into the new world and say, hey, we're going to do this according to the congregational way. And it's going pretty well. I mean, the Antinomians were a problem. They were more of an interior problem, an internal problem, right? Because they agreed on everything except antinomianism and all that sorts of bizarre stuff that came out of that. But then other people came from the outside and said, well, we want to be here too. And the Congregationalists like, well, we came here to start a Congregationalist society. Why are you here trying to subvert and meddle with us? Taking people into your churches who we already excommunicated. Why would you show up and create a church in which now you say none of the churches around you are true churches because they don't have anyone who's actually truly baptized? You can't reciprocate the Lord's Supper, even though we Congregationalists can affirm your adult baptism as being a legitimate baptism. You cannot affirm ours. We can receive you as full communicant members, but you cannot receive us. And so you're actually creating a subversive element within society by encouraging Christians to look around in this Christian society and calling it unchristian or non-Christian, to look around at all these other churches and say they're not true churches because they don't practice baptism how you understand it. And to look at your own civil magistrates, whom we call Christian magistrates, and you look at them and say, well, they're not Christian at all. It sounds like a subversive element has entered into a society that had a very declared and opened end for itself. And yet people show up and say, yeah, I'm just going to show up and do my thing. You might think there would be some action to suppress that because of the nature of the entry and practice. But is that sacralism as well? I guess that would be also sacralism. What about go to the American founding? Let's jump to the 1780s and 90s and 1800s, 1810s, 20s, and then I guess into the 30s. There were established churches within the states. Several established churches. Most of those states, it was established in the sense that the default church tax went to the established church. But in most places, people could assign their church tax to the church of their choice. So if you were Baptist, you could do your tax to the Baptist church. Nevertheless, we tend to call this established churches. I call them quasi-established because they're not really like they were before that. And so, but I guess that would be sacralism as well. Okay, so now sacralism has gone from unum sanctum to a church tax that supports the church of your choice in the American context. Okay. And I don't know, how much farther does it go? Like, after the churches, after all the establishments in the churches were effectively disbanded, there still were blasphemy laws on the books. They were upheld at times by the Supreme Court, which meant that you could not be a public atheist. You could be targeted by the law for being a public atheist, for arguing for atheism, or saying something that's atheistical. Is that sacralism as well? Isn't this the problem? I hope that as I've outlined and there's so many more too. I mentioned the Roman Catholic, unum sanctum, or like Erastianism, Presbyterianism, Congregationalism. We could do Church of England stuff. That's kind of more on the Erastian side. But there's just all these variations, and then you can have the kind of more open society, the more religiously open for the early days of like the Dutch Republic. And we can go into all these, but the term sacralism just covers all of that. All of it. And because it's bad, all that is thrown out. So I don't see what use is the term. Why not take a position, take the Congregationalist position, and then refute that position? Or if, let's say, you find a common element throughout all of the things I've mentioned, and it's essential to all of them, then name that thing and refute it. Because if it's essential to everything I've mentioned and it's refuted, then all those things fall. Now, it doesn't in itself, propose an alternative in a positive way, but it does make all those false as they're stated. So why not do that? Give that thing a name. Don't just toss out a term that covers everything, but no specific thing. There are wide varieties. I mean, linking together even like unum sanctum with even like Calvin's Geneva is grossly inaccurate. And certainly as Reformed political thought developed into the late 16th, early 19th century, into the mid 17th century, all that stuff it's just completely inaccurate. And it's for, frankly, like, I'm not saying James White is not a midwit. No, he's not. But the term sacralism is a term for midwits. And I that sounds insulting, but I think that's just an effect of what's true. Okay. That's what it is. It's for midwits. That's it. It's people who are not going to put in the time and the effort or don't care to look into the various distinctions of the political theologies over millennia. They just need a term to dismiss it all. Frankly, it's the same thing that people, when they toss around Marxism, oh yeah, the woke writer Marxist, it's just stupid. It's for midwits. It's for people who don't actually want to deal with the arguments, don't want to deal with the complexity, the details, the differences, and they just need a term. Once I have the term, I can then put everything under that term. You know, it's a bad term, it's a scary term, and anything that I think fits in there that I don't like, I'll put under the term. And therefore it's wrong, it's bad. I have a name for it. You know, when Wolf says this, I can call it sacralism. Or if I read something in Calvin, I can call it sacralism. If I read something in the early American founding, I can call it sacralism. New England sacralism. It's all very midwit tier. You think you're doing something intelligent, but you're not. You're just being, I don't know. I perhaps, I don't know what James White thinks he's doing. I just suspect he's focused on all these other things. He's done good work on other things. And then he gets into politics and political thought, which it's not easy to just pick up a text and kind of learn what people thought about politics. Someone's like, oh, well, I read, Institute's, book 4, chapter 20, and I know everything I need to know about Calvinist political thought, right? Or Vindicii, I read Vindicii. I read all that. So I know even that. I doubt people read it because it's a difficult read. But a lot of this stuff is actually kind of buried. A lot of Reformed political thought is buried in Latin. It's buried, and now it's available online, and more stuff is coming out like every single month. More stuff's coming out. All the source material is now available. So you can't just like read Institute's book 4, chapter 20 and say, Calvinist political thought. That was just him outlining. It wasn't even detailed. He even kind of like tosses it in there as if this is not something he's too concerned with. Calvin never wrote a political tract. That's all we've got. And there's like scattered comments in his commentaries that are actually very interesting, but they're not like a developed political treatise, right? It wasn't something he thought that he had to do. And it wasn't until the questions of resistance to tyranny arose that Calvinists started to write more on this stuff. And then you get a lot of political writings again in the 1580s, 90s, and then in the early 1600s. And of course, it just took off from there. You can look at Lex Rex and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot of writings on that. So anyway, I think you just like, I've said before that like the term worldview, if you just kind of stopped using the word worldview and you had to say something else, that most likely what you say is going to be smarter. I think that's also true with sacralism. If the moment you're about to use the word sacralism, if you stop yourself and use a different word or a different sentence or whatever, a paragraph, you'll be smarter. I don't just mean appear smarter. Like in the content, it'll be smarter. Most likely, hopefully. And so that's what I recommend. Just abandon it. It's not because I'm like scared of it. I just think it's dumb. I don't think it's useful. I think it distracts. It's the same thing. I don't want to keep repeating myself. It's the same stuff we've seen over and over and over in politics. You find a word, you put scary, you make the word scary, you put things underneath it. You don't actually have a clear definition of the term such that you can actually determine the limits of its extension, that is the things to which it refers. And it's just scary. So yeah, the scary term fallacy. There, I made up, someone already came up with that probably, but there it is. The scary term fallacy, don't do that. That's sacralism. Sacralism is scary term fallacy.